Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, we love to go deep on things that really matter, and today's topic is one that hits close to home for a lot of Floridians.
Definitely. It's something that's been generating a lot of buzz lately.
Exactly. We're talking about those new requirements in Florida for making sure condominium and cooperative buildings are structurally sound. It can seem a bit overwhelming at first, so we're going to break it all down.
That's right. We want to make sure everyone listening feels like they have a good grasp on these regulations and what they mean, whether they own a condo or thinking of buying one or just want to stay informed.
Absolutely. So, we dug deep into some key documents from the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, that's DBPR for short.
Yeah, their condominium information and resources document is a treasure trove of information, and it's going to be our main guide for this deep dive.
And we're zeroing in on two specific types of checks that are now required by the state.
Milestone inspections, or MIs, and then structural integrity reserve studies, which you'll often see abbreviated as SIRS.
Okay, so if you're living in a condo or co-op in Florida and it's three or more stories high, this is definitely something you need to know about.
Absolutely. Or if you're part of the management team for one of these buildings.
Exactly. Or even if you're just thinking about purchasing a condo, it's really important stuff to be aware of.
Definitely. And our mission today is to cut through all the legal jargon and highlight the key takeaways so you can feel confident you understand what's going on.
No one wants to spend hours poring over dense legal documents, right?
Exact.
Okay, so let's start with these milestone inspections, or MIs. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, think of a milestone inspection as a comprehensive checkup for a building as it ages.
Like taking your car in for a 50,000-mile service.
Exactly. The main purpose is to figure out if there's any substantial structural deterioration.
So not just a quick glance around, but a really thorough examination.
Exactly. And there's even a specific legal definition of it, which emphasizes just how serious this requirement is.
It's not just a suggestion, it's the law. Now, which buildings in Florida actually need to undergo these MIs?
Well, it's actually a pretty broad requirement. Pretty much any residential condominium or cooperative building that's 3 stories or taller in Florida needs to have a milestone inspection done.
Okay, so that covers a lot of buildings.
It does, and this applies even if it's a mixed ownership building,
Yeah.
not just entirely condos or entirely co-ops.
And it's not just a one-time thing when a building hits a certain age, right? There are specific intervals when these inspections need to happen.
That's right. In most cases, a building needs to have its first MI when it reaches 30 years old, and then it needs to have another one every 10 years after that.
So regular checkups to make sure everything is still in good shape?
Exactly. But there's a slight twist to this.
Oh,
The local enforcement agency, which is usually the city or county building department, can actually decide that certain local conditions require the first MI to be done sooner.
so if a building is in an area that might be prone to more wear and tear, for example.
Exactly. In those cases, they can require the initial MI at 25 years old, and then it would continue to be every 10 years after that.
That makes sense. Different environments can definitely affect how quickly a building ages. Now, how do they actually determine a building's age?
It all comes down to the certificate of occupancy.
So not when construction started or when people first moved in.
Nope, it's based on the date that the certificate of occupancy was issued. That's the official date when the building was deemed ready and safe to be occupied, and that's what triggers those MI deadlines.
Makes sense. So let's say there's a building that's already older than 30 years. When does that very first inspection need to happen?
There are some important deadlines coming up.
I bet there are a lot of buildings out there scrambling to get this done.
Definitely. For buildings that turned 30 years old before July 1st, 2022, that initial milestone inspection has to be finished by December 31st, 2024.
Coming up quickly.
Yes, and if a building hits that 30-year mark between July 1st, 2022 and December 31st, 2024, then the deadline for that first MI is December 31st, 2025.
Okay, so a lot of buildings need to get moving on this.
Definitely.
Now, who can actually perform these milestone inspections? I'm guessing it's not just any contractor who can do this.
You're absolutely right. You can't just hire any handyman. The state of Florida has specific requirements for who's qualified to perform a MI.
It's serious business.
It is.
Oh.
It has to be done by a Florida licensed architect or a Florida licensed engineer.
So someone with the specific expertise to assess a building's structural integrity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or a team can do it, but a licensed architect or engineer has to be leading that team and taking responsibility for the inspection's findings.
They're the ones signing off on it.
Right. And to make sure everything's above board, the DBPR has a tool on their website where you can verify someone's license.
That's great, so you can easily check if the person or team you're hiring is actually qualified.
Exactly.
Now, the big question, who's responsible for getting these inspections done? And more importantly, who pays for them?
Well, getting the inspection organized is the responsibility of the building's owners.
So for condominiums and co-ops, that would usually fall on the shoulders of the association.
Exactly. But there's an important exception here. If it's a single-family home, a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex, and it's 3 stories or fewer, they're actually exempt.
Okay, so those smaller multifamily buildings don't have to worry about this.
Right. But for everyone else, the cost is generally shared among the owners. The association as a whole is responsible, and so is any owner of a portion of the building that isn't owned by the association.
So it's something that could potentially impact HOA fees for condo owners.
Definitely.
How do building owners actually find out when a milestone inspection is due for their building?
Well, it's a multi-step process to make sure everyone's in the loop.
It's got to be more than just hoping people remember to do it.
Definitely not left to chance. It starts with the local enforcement agency, again, usually this city or county building department.
They're the ones keeping track of these deadlines.
Right. They're required to send a written notice, and it has to be sent by certified mail to the association and to any other owners of a portion of the building.
So there's a paper trail?
Exactly. And once the association gets this notice, they have 14 days to pass that information along to all the individual unit owners.
So it's a chain of communication. The local government tells the association, and the association tells the individual owners.
Right. And the DPPR recommends that you contact your city or county government to find out exactly who your local enforcement agency is. It can vary depending on where you live.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about what actually happens during one of these inspections. What's the inspector looking for?
Well, a milestone inspection actually involves 2 main phases.
A two-part process.
Exactly. The first phase is all about a visual assessment of the building structure. The inspector is looking for signs of substantial structural deterioration.
So anything that could potentially compromise the building's stability and safety?
Right. Things like major cracks in load-bearing walls or any noticeable sagging.
They're looking for the big red flags.
Exactly. Once that first phase is done, the inspector puts together a report. And if they don't find any substantial structural deterioration during that initial assessment, then they don't need to move on to the second phase.
So phase one is kind of like a screening process.
Exactly.
What triggers phase two then?
They only move on to phase 2 if they find evidence of substantial structural deterioration during that phase 1 assessment.
Okay, so if those initial warning signs are there, they go deeper.
Exactly. Phase 2 is a much more in-depth examination. They might do what's called destructive testing.
Destructive testing. That sounds a little intense.
It might sound dramatic, but it could be something as simple as carefully removing a small section of drywall to get a better look at the structure underneath.
Okay, so it's about getting a really clear picture of what's going on behind the surface.
Exactly. And after phase 2, they'll provide specific recommendations for repairs, including a proposed timeline for getting those repairs done.
So it's not just identifying problems, it's also about providing solutions.
Absolutely.
Now, what kind of information is included in these MI reports, whether it's from phase 1 or phase 2?
These reports are pretty detailed. They have to be.
There's a lot writing on them.
There is. First of all, it has to list all of the key findings and any actions the inspector is recommending. It also has to describe exactly how the inspection was conducted.
So very transparent and thorough.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And this is key. It has to specifically identify any substantial structural deterioration that was found and give clear recommendations for repairs.
Lay it all out.
Right. They also have to explicitly state whether they found any conditions that they consider unsafe or dangerous.
That's important to know.
Definitely. And even if they find issues that aren't deemed substantial, if they think something needs attention, they'll make recommendations for preventative or remedial repairs.
So they're not just looking for major problems, they're also trying to catch things early on.
Exactly. And the report has to highlight any areas of the building that they think need further inspection in the future.
Kind of like flagging things to keep an eye on.
Exactly. To top it all off, there's a requirement for a separate, easy-to-understand summary of the main findings.
That's great because the full report might be a bit technical for some people to understand.
Exactly. And the entire report has to be signed and sealed by the licensed professional who did the inspection. It's their professional stamp of approval.
Their name is on the line.
Exactly.
Now, what if the deadline for getting that initial milestone inspection done is approaching, but for some reason the inspection can't be completed on time? Is there any wiggle room there?
Yeah, there's some flexibility built into the system.
It wouldn't be very practical if there wasn't.
Right. The local enforcement agency can grant an extension for that initial deadline.
Under what circumstances?
Well, the building owners would need to show that they have a signed contract with a qualified architect or engineer, and it's just taking longer than expected to actually complete the inspection. They can also grant extensions if there are other legitimate reasons why the inspection can't be done on time.
So there's a process for handling those real-world situations that inevitably pop up.
Exactly.
Okay, once the milestone inspection is finished, what happens next?
So the association gets a copy of the full report, and then they have to distribute that easy-to-read summary that we talked about to all the individual unit owners.
Within a certain time frame?
Yes, they have 45 days to get that summary out to everyone.
Making sure everyone's informed.
Exactly. And they also have to post a copy of that summary in a visible location within the building itself.
So you can't miss it.
Right. And if the association have a website, then the full report, along with the summary, has to be posted there as well.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely.
Now, let's say that phase 2 report comes back and it says that repairs are needed. What kind of timeline are we talking about to get those issues fixed?
Building owners have year 365 days, to be exact, to complete all the necessary repairs that are outlined in that Phase 2 report.
So they have some time to get it done, but it's definitely not something they can put off indefinitely.
Right. And once the repairs are finished, there has to be another inspection to confirm that everything's been done properly.
A final check to make sure everything is up to code and the building is safe.
Exactly.
Okay, that gives us a pretty good understanding of milestone inspections. Now, let's dive into the other major requirement we mentioned. Structural Integrity Reserve Studies, or SIRS. What are those all about?
Think of a SIRS as a very targeted financial planning tool.
So we're shifting gears from physical inspections to financial planning now.
Exactly. You've probably heard of reserve studies in general.
Yeah, those are pretty common for HOAs and condo associations.
Right. Those studies look at all the different parts of a building that the association is responsible for maintaining and figure out how much money needs to be set aside to cover future repairs and replacements.
Planning for the inevitable wear and tear.
Exactly. A SIRS is a more focused version of that. It specifically looks at the major structural elements of a building.
So it's making sure there's enough money in the bank to take care of those big ticket structural repairs down the line.
Exactly. It's all about ensuring the long-term structural health of the building, and it's a key part of responsible financial management for condo and co-op associations.
That makes sense. Now, when we talk about these structural elements, is there a specific list of what's included in a SIRS?
Yes, Florida law actually spells out 8 specific categories that have to be included.
Okay, let's hear them.
It covers the roof, the building's main structural systems, things like the foundation, beams, and columns.
The backbone of the building.
Exactly. Then there's fireproofing and all the fire protection systems, the plumbing systems, the electrical system.
Covering all the essentials?
Right. And then it includes waterproofing and exterior painting, which help protect the building's structure.
So it's not just about the internal components, it's about the exterior, too.
Exactly. And they also have to include windows and exterior doors because they're part of what's called the building envelope, basically the outer shell that keeps the elements out.
Makes sense.
And finally, they have to include any other element that would cost more than $10,000 to repair or replace and is determined to impact the structural integrity of the building based on the visual inspection that's part of the SIRS.
So it's pretty comprehensive.
Definitely. They want to make sure they're covering all the bases when it comes to the building's structural health.
Now, which associations need to have a SIRS done? Is it the same as the milestone inspections?
It's a very similar requirement. Any residential condominium association responsible for a building that's 3 stories or taller needs to get a SIRS done.
So pretty much the same group that needs to worry about MIs.
Exactly. And just like the MIs, it's not a one-time thing. A new SIRS has to be done at least every 10 years.
Okay, so regular check-ins on the financial planning side as well.
Exactly.
And just like with the MIs, there are probably specific qualifications for who can perform a SIRS.
Absolutely. There are actually 2 main components to a SIRS. There's a financial analysis part, and then there's a visual inspection part.
So it's a blend of financial expertise and hands-on assessment.
Right. The financial study needs to be done by someone who's qualified to do that kind of work. which makes sense.
You want someone who knows their numbers.
Definitely. But the visual inspection has to be done, or at least verified, by a Florida licensed engineer, a Florida licensed architect, or someone with a specific certification in reserve studies.
So, similar to the MIs, it has to be someone with the expertise to assess the structural elements.
Exactly. They could be a certified reserve specialist,
Mm.
or CRS, through the Community Associations Institute, or a professional reserve analyst, or APRA, through the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts.
Okay, so there are different paths to becoming qualified, but they all involve specialized knowledge of building structures and reserve studies.
Right. And you can verify the licenses of engineers and architects on the DBPR website. And you can usually find directories of certified reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts through their respective organizations.
Always good to do your due diligence and make sure you're hiring qualified
Oh,
professionals.
really?
Okay, so the association gets their SIRS done. What happens next? What do they need to do with it?
Well, as of July 1st, 2024, they have 45 days after the SIRS is complete to take a couple of important steps. First, they have to notify all the unit owners in writing.
Letting them know the SIRS is done.
Exactly. And that it's available for them to review and get a copy of.
Transparency is key here.
Absolutely. And they also have to notify the DBPR's Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes that the SIRS has been completed.
So the state is keeping tabs on who's complying.
Exactly.
And what kind of information does that SIRS report actually contain? What are the owners going to learn about their building?
It's a pretty comprehensive document. It lists all those structural elements that we talked about earlier. And for each one, it estimates how long it's expected to last before needing major repairs or replacement.
So it's giving them a timeline for when things might start wearing out.
Exactly. They call that the component's expected lifespan. Then it takes a look at how much money the association currently has in reserve.
How much they've already saved.
Exactly. And based on those lifespans and the current reserve funds, it gives recommendations for how the association should be saving money going forward to cover those future costs.
So it's like a roadmap for keeping the building financially healthy over the long term.
Exactly.
Now, how does having a SIRS actually affect the fees that unit owners pay?
This is where it gets really real for condo owners,
It's going to hit their wallets.
potentially. Associations are required to follow the reserve funding schedule that's laid out in their SIRS. So if the SIRS shows that they don't have enough money saved up based on those projected costs, then they're likely going to need to raise fees.
To make sure there's enough money in the reserves to cover those future repairs and replacements.
Exactly. It's all about avoiding a situation where a major repair is needed and the association doesn't have the funds to cover it.
Which could lead to some really big special assessments.
Exactly. It's much better to plan ahead and spread those costs out over time.
Absolutely. Are there any specific dates that unit owners should be aware of when it comes to the SIRS funding?
Yeah, there are some key dates to keep in mind. For any budget that's adopted on or after January 1st, 2025, associations have to base their budget on their most recent SIRS, and they can't waive reserves for those structural items anymore. That's a big change.
So no more kicking the can down the road on funding those essential repairs.
Right. Now, for budgets adopted before December 31st, 2024, associations did have the option to waive SIRS reserves, but that option goes away starting January 1st, 2026.
So everyone needs to be on board with funding those structural reserves based on their SIRS starting in 2026.
Exactly.
What about the deadlines for actually getting the initial SIRS completed?
For associations that were already in existence and controlled by unit owners on or before July 1st, 2022, they have until December 31st, 2024 to get their first SIRS done.
Another important deadline coming up fast.
It is. But there is some flexibility. If an association also needs a milestone inspection by December 31st, 2026, they can do the SIRS at the same time, but it can't be done any later than that.
So December 31st, 2024 and December 31st, 2026 are key dates for a lot of associations.
Definitely.
Okay, what role does the DBPR play in all of this? It's more than just providing the information, right?
Oh, they're definitely involved in the process. For starters, they're going to publish a list of all the condominiums that have completed a SIRS in their annual report that comes out at the end of 2024.
So they're shining a spotlight on who's meeting the requirements.
Exactly. And they're also creating a public database of all the associations that have submitted their completed SIRS information.
That'll be a great resource for owners who want to see if their association is in compliance.
Absolutely. They're aiming to have that database up and running by January 1st, 2025, and they'll have a link to it right on their website.
Fantastic. Now, how does an association actually report to the DBPR that their SIRS is done?
They have a few options. They can do it online through a form on the DBPR website.
Streamlining the process.
Exactly. Or they can email the information or even mail it in.
So they're trying to make it as easy as possible for associations to comply.
Definitely. If they're mailing it in, they have to use a specific form, the SIRS reporting form, and send it to the division's office in Tallahassee.
And what if an association manages multiple condominiums?
Good question. They have to submit a separate form for each individual project.
No cutting corners.
Right.
Now, we talked about that public database of SIRS information. What will people actually be able to see in that database?
It's pretty straightforward. They'll be able to see the information exactly as it was submitted by the associations.
So what you see is what you get.
Exactly. And only submissions where they provided all the necessary information on the form will be included.
Makes sense.
And there are different processing times depending on how the information is submitted.
So if it's submitted online, it'll show up faster.
Exactly. Online submissions usually show up within 1 business day. For email or regular mail, it might take up to 2 weeks.
Okay, so there's a bit of a lag if you're doing it the old-fashioned way.
Right. And the DBPR has said that they'll try to reach out to associations if they submit incomplete forms to try to get that missing information.
So they're really trying to work with people to make sure the database is accurate and up to date.
Exactly.
Now, let's say a unit owner has concerns about their association's SIRS. Maybe they think something's not right or wasn't done properly. What can they do?
There are a couple of avenues they can pursue.
Because you don't want people to just feel helpless if they think something's wrong.
Exactly. If they think they're being charged for things that shouldn't be included in the SIRS assessments, like regular landscaping or pool maintenance, they can file a complaint with the DBPR's Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes.
So if they think the association is trying to slip in non-structural expenses under the guise of the SIRS,
Exactly.
what if their concern isn't about the fees, but about the SIRS itself?
If they think it wasn't done properly or the person who did it wasn't qualified, they can actually file a complaint with the appropriate licensing board.
So there are different channels depending on the nature of the complaint.
Right. If it's about an architect, they would complain to the Florida Board of Architecture and Interior Design Architect. If it's about an engineer, they'd go to the Florida Board of Professional Engineers.
That makes sense.
And if they're concerned about a CAM who might have acted as a reserve specialist or analyst without the proper qualifications, then they can file a complaint directly with the DBPR.
So there are checks and balances in place to make sure everything is being done according to the rules.
Exactly.
Now, just to recap and make sure everyone's clear on the difference, could you go over the key distinctions between a milestone inspection and a structural integrity reserve study?
Sure. The main difference is that a milestone inspection is focused on the current physical state of the building structure.
It's about what's happening right now.
Exactly. They're looking at those load-bearing elements to see if there's any significant deterioration. A SIRS, on the other hand, is more about looking ahead and planning for the future.
It's about the financial side of keeping those structural components in good shape over time.
Right. It identifies all the key structural elements, estimates their lifespans, and then recommends a plan for funding those future repairs and replacements.
So one is about assessing the current physical condition, and the other is about planning for the future financial needs.
Exactly.
Now, is there ever a situation where a milestone inspection can actually serve as a substitute for the visual inspection part of a SIRS?
Yes, there are a couple of situations where that's possible. If an association needs a milestone inspection by December 31st, 2026, they can do their SIRS at the same time.
So they can kind of kill two birds with one stone?
Exactly. And if they had a milestone inspection or even a similar inspection required by a local government within the past 5 years, and that previous inspection meets the requirements for a SIRS visual inspection, they can use that instead of doing a separate visual inspection for the SIRS.
That makes sense. No need to duplicate efforts if a recent inspection already covers the necessary ground.
Right. But even in those cases, the full SIRS, including the financial analysis, still has to be completed by that December 31st, 2026 deadline.
Okay, so it streamlines the process, but it doesn't get them completely off the hook for the SIRS.
Exactly.
And I know we briefly mentioned something about alternative funding methods for certain types of associations.
Yeah, there's a provision for multi-condominium associations that operate 25 or more individual condominiums.
So those really large associations.
Exactly. They might be able to use a different method for funding their reserves, but it's very specific. and it's governed by a particular section of the Florida statutes.
So if an association thinks they might qualify, they definitely need to dig into those statutes and see if they meet all the criteria.
Absolutely.
This is a lot of information to digest. What resources are available for listeners who want to learn more?
The best place to start is the DDPR website. They have a whole page dedicated to inspections. They have a frequently asked questions section that's really helpful.
Always a good place to start.
Right.
Yeah.
And they also have all their contact information right there on the page if you need to get in touch with them directly.
Perfect. We'll make sure to include a link to that webpage in our show notes so everyone can easily find it.
Sounds good.
So, to wrap things up, what would you say are the key takeaways from our deep dive into these new Florida regulations?
The most important thing to remember is that these inspections are now mandatory for a lot of buildings in Florida. If you live in a condo or co-op that's 3 stories or taller, this applies to you.
And these inspections are all about ensuring the safety and structural integrity of these buildings.
Exactly. Milestone inspections are about identifying any existing problems, and structural integrity reserve studies are about making sure there's a plan in place to fund those future repairs and replacements.
And there are some important deadlines coming up that owners and associations need to be aware of.
Definitely. Many initial milestone inspections are due by the end of 2024 or 2025, and those initial structural integrity reserve studies need to be done by the end of 2024 for a lot of existing associations.
So it's time to get moving on this. Don't wait until the last minute.
Fully not.
We encourage all of our listeners to review any notices they receive from their associations and to check out all the resources on the DBPR website.
That website is www.floridabuilding.org.
And as you're thinking about all of this, consider this. How do you think these new regulations will impact the future of condo living in Florida? Will it make condos more expensive? Will it lead to more maintenance and repairs being done proactively? It's something to ponder.
It's a big question, and only time will tell how it all plays out.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really informative deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. We'll see you next time.